So during his years as the premier of the Soviet Union, 1958 to 1964, Nikita Khrushchev often publicly denounced many of the atrocities of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. And little history lesson for those who didn't live through the Cuba missile crisis. Stalin, who came before Khrushchev, was a ruthless dictator, and the way dictators work is anybody who has a contrary opinion or says anything remotely against the dictator, they get eliminated. Historians estimate that Stalin killed anywhere from 6 million to 20 million people, slaughtered, just wholesale populations of people. Anybody who he thought didn't have the right to exist. Well, Khrushchev, who came after him, was not a nice guy either, right? But wasn't quite as, murderous as Stalin was. And he would sometimes publicly, denigrate Stalin's ruthlessness. But during one speech, when Khrushchev was interrupted by a heckler who shouted, you criticize Stalin, but you worked with him and you did nothing about it. And he didn't take his shoe off and slam it on the pulpit, but he, who said that? And the room became quiet. Everybody was gripped with fear. And no one would own up to having said anything. And after a few moments of silence, Khrushchev says, now you know why I didn't say anything. Because fear paralyzes people. We know that. Fear is one of the most powerful forces on the face of the earth. And believe me, there are people who know that and know how to use it to manipulate us. And I'm not a conspiracy theory kind of guy. I've just studied advertising, right? There's the old saying, sex sells. Well, you know what? Fear sells a lot more powerfully, right? You can get people to buy any product if you can make them somewhat afraid that if they don't have this product, somehow they won't be loved or they won't fit in, right? Or they won't be cool or whatever. So believe me, fear, that's what we get shovel full portions of fear and anger, right? Just to keep us hooked on cable news networks, right? That's what they use to keep you hooked, right? Fear and anger. So we know fear can grip us. And, fear is so powerful that it can lead otherwise good people and decent people to compromise their convictions or remain silent in the face of wrongdoing or fail to do what they know is right. That is why Jesus in this short gospel says in slightly varied versions, says 3 times, be not afraid. 3 times in a short passage, because he knows that fear will challenge the disciples. And believe me, when this gospel was written in the first century, of course, not everything that Jesus ever said or did was written down. What was written down was most important to the people in the first century when it was written. And what was important to them was this often repeated phrase of Jesus, be not afraid. Because why? Because they were being persecuted. Right? In the first century, Christians were beaten, imprisoned, stoned, and killed. So being publicly known as a disciple of Jesus could cost a person everything. And we know that even today. Many Christians live under similar threats. Christian believers in parts of the Middle East, Asia, Africa, continue to face violence, discrimination, persecution, and fear of death every day. Many have lost their homes, their freedom, and their lives. But most of us North Americans don't face that level of fear of loss of life every day. But that's not to say we don't have our own portfolio or basket full of fears. And so I want to look at, among the many different fears that we face, I'm just going to narrow it down to 3 that I want to focus on today. I want to focus on the fear we have of crowds, the fear we have of those close to us, and sometimes even fear of ourselves, right? So the fear of the crowds, those who are close to us, and ourselves. So first, let's just look at what I mean by the fear of the crowd. That's basically peer pressure, right? We know the teachings of Christ. We know the dignity of every person. We know the call to justice and charity and truth. Yet how often, and I'll attest to this, how often do we hesitate to speak about our faith because we fear being judged? Or we remain silent about moral truths because we do not want to, appear different or upset the apple cart. And we spend money on things and buy things simply because we want to fit in, even though we have absolutely no need, right, of the things. And we all know that, I walk around the neighborhood, and when people's garage doors are open, I see, oh wow, they can't even get any cars in because they bought all this stuff that they now are packed in the garage, right? Each of those things were something we bought at some point, thinking that was going to make our lives so much more complete. We chase approval, popularity, acceptance, and we worry about fitting in. And I as much as I preach to anybody else, I'm preaching to myself, because I will tell you that I have done a lot of stupid things in my life just to fit in, right? Really stupid things. I won't go into details, but I hope you believe me. So we now know that the crowd can be a powerful force. But Jesus reminds us that discipleship is not about following the crowd. It's about following Him, right? So what do I mean by fear of those closest to us? That might sound odd. Why would we fear the people closest to us? Well, sometimes we're afraid to speak the truth to those who are closest to us because we're afraid of losing the relationship. In families, we avoid difficult conversations sometimes because, we don't want conflict. Or we ignore unhealthy behavior because confronting it might create tension in the family. Parents may hesitate to provide guidance or discipline because they fear being seen as controlling, outdated, or out of touch, right? Or they don't want their kids to be out of touch. So here is an incredibly relevant example. The book that came out last year, and it's not just this book, there is tons of research on the effects of smartphones on adolescents, very specifically. I know I've lost half of my attention span, right? I mean, my attention span has just whittled down to next to nothing. But so we know the effects are bad enough on adults, but it's particularly harmful when adolescents, while their brains are still forming, the overexposure to social media and stuff. But there was a book that kind of packaged a lot of research last year, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And in it, Jonathan Haidt argues that one of the most effective steps parents can take to protect the mental health of adolescents is to delay giving them a smartphone until after adolescence, and instead provide a basic mobile phone that allows only calls and texts, right? That's his big recommendation. And because such phones enable communication and safety without exposing the young person to the constant pressure of social media and the endless clickbait, right, distraction. Yet Haidt notes that the greatest obstacle, even though it's well documented and we know this, and we know that the child's well-being is that they don't get too much exposure, even though this is so well documented, there's so much social pressure created by peers that children understandably fear being left out, appearing different, or missing out on social connections when their friends all have smartphones. Now, this places, I don't know what to tell you, the parents who are in this situation, this places parents in an extremely difficult position, because even when the harmful effects are clear, because the social environment makes it hard for any one family to act alone. So his other recommendation is families have to work together, because if your kid is the only kid who doesn't have a smartphone, that hurts, right? So if you kind of can make a pact with other families that, no smartphones until after adolescence, that's his big recommendation. But the bottom line is that our children today face enormous pressure from social media, popular culture, and peer expectations. And they need parents and grandparents who will lovingly teach them how to live as disciples of Jesus. Yet doing so often requires courage. Love sometimes requires difficult conversations, saying no, and standing firm. And so if you make that argument to your adolescent that maybe you should wait a while to have a smartphone, and they object, you can just blame me. Father Kennedy said so, right? Just I'll take the heat. But finally, let me get to the third fear. We fear ourselves, and that might strike you as a bit odd. I'm not afraid of myself, but think of it this way, because perhaps this is the deepest fear of all. We know our weaknesses. We know our failures. We know our sins and our shortcomings. And sometimes we become convinced that we're just not good enough, right? Or that God cannot love us fully, or that we really can't be disciples because we're not holy enough, or talented enough, or courageous enough, or faithful enough, or not enough this or that, or whatever, right? These are these tapes that we can play in our minds sometimes that we're not enough. And as a result, many people remain on the sidelines of discipleship because they fear being inadequate, right? But listen to the words of Pope St. John Paul II. He said several years ago, "Do not be afraid even of your own weakness and inadequacy. The divine master has said, 'I am with you always until the end of the world.'" So what a beautiful reminder. God never called perfect people to be disciples. Jesus called fishermen, corrupt tax collectors, persecutors like St. Paul, and sinners. The question is not whether or not we are good enough or strong enough or whatever enough. The question is whether we trust in Christ, who is strong enough. There is tremendous potential in each one of us. And there are opportunities every day to share God's love, to speak words of hope, to serve someone in need, or to witness to the gospel. But fear can prevent us from taking that first step. And Jesus knows this. This is why he repeats over and over again, "Do not be afraid." But notice something equally as important. Jesus does not just simply tell us not to be afraid. He tells us what reason we have not to be afraid. The reason is God's loving care. He gives a beautiful image of how the depths of God's loving care when he says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a small coin? Yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's knowledge." A sparrow may seem insignificant. Yet Jesus says that not one of them falls to the ground without the Father knowing. And then he adds, even all the hairs of your head are counted. Well, for some of us, that doesn't take much to count them. Others, it takes a little more. But, we lose hair all the time and we don't think about it. But this concept that God knows even every hair on our heads. If God pays that level of attention to the smallest details of creation, how much more does God care about your struggles, your fears, your hopes, your disappointments, and your future? And so Jesus is telling us we're not alone. We are not forgotten or abandoned. We are not, we don't have to figure this out all by ourselves. We are beloved children of a loving Father. And that is the foundation, the basis for our courage. And it's in that courage then we can face our fears. And it doesn't mean that life is going to be easy, does it? Unfortunately. Life was not easy for Jesus, and he never promised that it would be easy for us. Jesus knows what it means to be misunderstood, as he was misunderstood, and to have his reputation attacked. Jesus knows what it means to be rejected by his own family, right? And friends, and pressured by political and religious leaders. Jesus knows what it means to lose everything and suffer death itself. So whatever fears we carry, Christ has already gone before us. And wherever Jesus calls us to go, he has already cleared the path. And because Jesus is risen from the dead, fear no longer has the final word. The cross appeared to be the ending, but it became a new beginning. Victory over fear was secured on Calvary and confirmed on Easter morning. And I'll leave you with the words of St. John Paul II. And I'm focusing on his quotes because think about who he was and the oppression and the fear that he was raised under. He was raised, right, in Poland under Nazi occupation and then under Soviet, right, oppression. That's the life he lived. And yet he could so beautifully speak of courage and hope and not having fear. Do not be afraid to go out on the streets and into public places like the first apostles who preached Christ and the good news of salvation. In the squares of the cities, towns, and villages, this is no time to be ashamed of the gospel. It is time to preach it from the rooftops. Be not afraid.